Reconciliation's continuing speaker series on truth-telling. My name is Joe McDaniel Jr., and I serve as chair of the commission. We are delighted that you have joined us this evening. We have a wonderful speaker for you, but before I introduce her, I would like to introduce some folks that will be helping out with this evening's presentation. Ms. Nancy Bolton-Back will be monitoring questions in the chat box, and Mr. Robbie Rudnerson is our technical expert. I have several etiquette rules that will govern our time together. First, all microphones are muted automatically to avoid any interruptions. And B, as you listen to the presentation, write your questions in the chat box, and time permitting, they will be addressed during the question and answer period. And now I would like to welcome the Reverend Deacon Susan McKee, who will lead us in an opening prayer. Susan?
Thank you. Direct us, O Lord, in all our doings with your most gracious favor, and further us with your continual help, that in all our works begun this evening, continued and ended in you, we may glorify your holy name, and finally, by your mercy, obtain everlasting life through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Thank you, Susan, for those inspiring words of prayer. And now to briefly address why we are here tonight and why tonight's presentation is so important. The Commission's mission statement reads as follows. As members of the Jesus movement, our mission is to dismantle individual and institutional racism by sharing resources and creating opportunities that inspire and empower faith communities and the larger community, resulting in reconciliation and restoration of all God's people. How do we do that, you may ask? We do that through truth-telling, through our pilgrimages, which have included visits to the EJI Memorial and Museum in Montgomery, Alabama, and to the Whitney Plantation in Louisiana. We also do it by conducting sacred listening sessions through our racial reconciliation workshops, and we also do it by bringing accomplished speakers who have shared insightful perspectives on sometimes gut-wrenching stories of past and present inequities that have shaped and continue to shape this country. Truth-telling is important because you can never get to where you need to be without knowing from where you came. And with that in mind, the Diocese of the Central Gulf Coast Commission on Racial Justice and Reconciliation would like to begin tonight's truth-telling of racial injustice by acknowledging the oppression of the first inhabitants of this continent, Native Americans. We, the Diocese of the Central Gulf Coast, are on lands that belong to the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, Seminole, and Apache nations for centuries before Europeans arrived. Under the banner of Christianity, white Europeans came to America and began taking over indigenous land. They justified their land theft with a medieval Christian theory called the right of discovery. According to the medieval theory, European nations had the legal right to seize land that belonged to non-Christians. With this Christian doctrine as a weapon, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, Seminole, and Apache nations were expelled from their homes all around us and exiled to what is now Oklahoma. Native land theft and human displacement were undertaken and accomplished by people who identified themselves as Christians. However, today we recognize this early American injustice to Native people and its terrible distortion of Christian principles. This brings me to tonight's speaker, the Reverend Rachel Talbert Hamilton. Rachel is an Indigenous ordained priest in the Episcopal Church. As a Cheyenne First Nation person, she represents the Episcopal Church on the board of the Anglican Indigenous Network. She served on the Episcopal Church delegation to the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and served on the presiding bishop's delegation to the United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP 26. Rachel has 30 years of experience in cross-cultural communication, specialized ministry, social justice advocacy, and environmental advocacy. She is the founder of Circles of Color, a grassroots community of Episcopalians of color and authentic allies in the Episcopal Church of Western Washington, and serves on the board of Paths to Understanding, an organization of interfaith leaders committed to mutual support on issues of social justice. Rachel is also a board-certified healthcare chaplain endorsed through the Office of the Bishop Suffragan for the Armed Forces and Federal Ministries. With an academic background in cultural anthropology and cross-cultural communication, Rachel specializes in assessment and care plan development for recovery processes related to incidences of community and organizational trauma. As a writer, her work has appeared in the Anglican Theological Review, God's Space, Church Foundation Vital Practices, The Living Church, and many other publications. She maintains a reflective commentary blog site called Green Spirit. Rachel is currently director of Trinity Episcopal Church in Everett, Washington, and serves as the vice president of the House of Deputies for the Episcopal Church. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the Reverend Rachel Talbert Hamilton. Rachel?
Thank you for that introduction, Joe. I appreciate that. Thank you. Yes, my Anglo name is Rachel Tabor Hamilton. My Shikani name is Jembahake, and my Athabascan name is Kahojina. And I'm so glad to and honored to be with you tonight. So thank you for that. What I'm going to be sharing with you in just a few minutes is a whole lot of information. And some of it you may have heard about, and some of it you may be new, but all of what I'm going to weave together for you may feel like more than you're going to be able to take in one go and in the time that we have. I'm going to be talking and presenting for about 45 minutes to an hour. And I promise you, feel like that because of the sheer amount of content that we're going to walk through until we get to an opportunity for us to do some sharing and answer some questions. I'm going to begin with a little bit of the orientation of the doctrine of discovery that Joe was referring to, so that we have that common information together, and then move into the Episcopal Church work. So you'll see me sort of weaving together what the Episcopal Church is doing, what Christian heritage impact has been for white supremacy and racism with regard to Indigenous people specifically. And then we'll get into where are we headed as a church with our Indigenous leadership, because it's very exciting and a very important time right now. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and put on my reading glasses so I have a chance of actually looking at it with you. So let me do that. Okay, so firstly, none of the ways that you might feel that you are having a response to this, no response is a wrong response. It's going to tell you something authentic and honest about your encounter with this information today. So I invite you to just, rest in that. Don't be anxious about how you're feeling or responding. And I'm happy to help unpack all of that with you afterwards. Thank you. I'd like us to begin, and with the rest of you muted, would you join me in this prayer as we begin from the Disciples' Prayer Book? It's a resource from Indigenous Ministries of the Episcopal Church. Let us pray. Creator, we give you thanks for all you are and all you bring to us for our visit within your creation. In Jesus, you place the gospel in the center of this sacred circle, through which all of creation is related. You show us the way to live a generous and compassionate life. Give us your live together with respect and commitment as we grow in your spirit. For you are God, now and forever. Amen. Thank you. I want to begin with a foundation of a definition of Indigenous communities that has been put forward by Jose Martinez Cobo of the United Nations, and how he talks about this here on the screen. Indigenous communities, peoples, and nations are those which, having a historical continuity with pre-invasion and pre-colonial societies that developed on their own territories, consider themselves distinct from other sectors of societies now prevailing on those territories or parts of them. So essentially in this, we're hearing through this study of the problem of discrimination against Indigenous populations report from the United Nations. Indigenous peoples are those peoples who have experienced, quite particularly, colonialism and its impact because they were people original to the land that were colonized. Excuse me. Now, first of all, you're going to hear lots of different terms that I may interchange as I'm talking about Indigenous people. When the word Indigenous is referring to people, it needs to be capitalized to make it distinct from how we refer to Indigenous plants or Indigenous other things. So Indigenous is a very safe word to use when talking about most Native communities. Native is also another word that you'll hear me use. You'll hear First Nation as a term that's used in prevalency in Canada to distinguish us as being the first folks living on the land before colonial migration from Western Europe. And you'll hear me also talk about the Aboriginals, and that is the term used in Australia. So lots of ways, and the way to really know if you're using the one that the tribe that you're interacting with prefers, or even the Indigenous person you're interacting with prefers, you just go ahead and ask. Some want to be even referred to as corporations, like the Tlingit is a corporation in Alaska. And others do still say, it's okay, we are the Spokane tribe of Indians. And they have adopted that terminology, and it is not offensive to them. So just asking outright, how does the individual or the group prefer to be referred to? And many times today, they're going to give you their native name, their Indigenous name. I love this little t-shirt down on the right, because this is what our young adult Native youth are wearing. They refer to themselves by 3 letters, NDN, Indian. And so if you see that term, you know you've got a pretty snazzy, cool young adult in front of you. About myself, I want to orient you to my heritage. Indigenous heritage comes from my mother's side of the family. And here's a picture of her with her full-blooded father, and who is from Canada and migrated here and into Pennsylvania and married the woman on the far left, my grandmother. My mom is about 15 years old in this picture, and she is the oldest daughter. And in my tradition, the heritage and cultural lifeways and important learnings are handed down through the matrilineal lineage as a matriarchy. So it goes from oldest daughter to oldest daughter. And even my mother's younger sister, my aunt, calls me to ask me about certain protocols or stories or remembrances, because that's what I received from mom as oldest daughter to oldest daughter. And here's where the Shakan actually reside. If you see off to the right, that kind of little wedgy arrow, you'll see where we are kind of located at the confluence of the Fraser River and Thompson River in British Columbia. And the story, the whole history of Doctrine of Discovery is very personal to me and my family. My grandfather's mother was concerned that he, Cecil, and his younger brother would be taken away to boarding schools. And at one point, as a medicine person on the tribe and notated by the government, someone who could do literal body counts, she became very fearful and reported her 2 children as having died from scarlet fever. And so the 2 kids went with their father to Vancouver. And so it's a challenging thing to sort of say, what is the new life after that? She actually herself died of influenza shortly after she had them leave. On my father's side, just to share, is the really interesting paradox that my father's relatives, the earliest ones, come over the second ship called the Mayflower in the 1600s. So they come a little bit later, and they actually represent, the colonizing influence on that side of the family. And I remember having a powerful conversation with my father as a young person, where I was talking about Native heritage and things that were important that I wanted to continue to preserve. And he got really quiet and he said, aren't you proud of my side of the family? And so much of my life has been really trying to weave together that bicultural heritage and historical heritage, and find the places where there's pain on both sides, and find the places where there is genuine reason to have pride. And I can tell you from that experience that that's exactly what the Episcopal Church is going through with regard to its history with Indigenous people. It is a colonizing history, a colonizing influence that continues in many ways. And it is also a group, I believe, that has made important strides and will continue to do that, I believe, in supporting Native leadership in the church. By the way that Indigenous people refer to family is a lot wider than only our blood relatives that I just had shared pictures with you. Our sense of family, our aunties and uncles and cousins is very vast and goes outside our tribes, our everything, and into the people that we create community with as Indigenous people. And what you're seeing in this slide are folks in my diocese on the upper two pictures as a kind of Native folks coming together in the Diocese of Olympia to do worship. And then also down below, you see various gatherings of Indigenous leaders in the church. And we look to one another as very special family, extended family, and mutually supportive of one another. And that really takes an important form in our annual gathering called Winter Talk. And this harkens back to a tradition in many North American Indigenous communities where the winter was used as the time to do important teaching and indoctrination into medicine lodges and warrior lodges and important communities. And you're hearing important stories that you only are going to hear in the wintertime in my tradition. Because the nights are long, the days are cold, and it's the perfect time to sort of tell the Oedipus version of our longest stories and history. And this most recent one, the one we last got together with before COVID hit, was actually here in Seattle. So these are pictures of that gathering. You can see by that, this is a portion, but a good portion, representative of the Indigenous Episcopalians across the church. Okay, so we turn to the doctrine of discovery. In the beginning, what is this doctrine of discovery? It's not something neat and tidy that comes as one source that you can go and look at and understand. It is rather a set of international laws and principles informed by European worldview quite specifically, which is further shaped and intimately wedded to Christian theology. It's impossible to separate out the history of Western civilization from Christian thought and development. Specifically, it has its roots in the theology of the 15th and 16th centuries. It is a set of legal precedents that still regulate Indigenous rights and life today, and continues to inform dominant culture beliefs in white superiority, Christian nationalism, and the divine destiny that white folks have in America. It is also a set of racist principles interwoven in all of that theology and legalism based on a theological foundation that Christian nations and Christian monarchs are exceptional with divinely endowed rights, while non-Christians and non-whites are in that system culturally seen as inferior and not entitled to civil rights. In many theological perspectives, even questioned whether people of color actually had souls or feelings. And we'll talk about that a little bit more coming up. what is important to understand is in the time when there really was sort of one unified, well, not terribly unified, but one understanding of church, which was the Catholic tradition. In those days, the papacy really established the foundational documents of the doctrine of discovery through a series of papal bulls, which are so called because of the very large wax red seals that close them and because they look like bull's eyes. So here, want to talk a little bit, about Pope Nicholas V, who created one of the earliest papal bulls called the Roman Pontiff in 1454. It followed on the heels of another bull called Dum Diversus, and it conferred the crown of Portugal dominion over all the lands that it would discover in their first time by navigators. And what you see on the right is Henry the Navigator, who was the person doing a lot of exploration on behalf of England. So here's this papal bull. Inter Cetera is another one issued by Pope Alexander VI, and it has a central role in justifying the Spanish conquest of the New World and the indigenous peoples there. It basically said the only people entitled to make claims on land that was being discovered were not indigenous people, but rather the Christian monarchs and nations that encountered them. So in this Inter Cetera, there is language that essentially says Christian, that any land not inhabited by Christians was available to be discovered, to be claimed, and to be rightly exploited for its natural resources. And this bull declares the Catholic faith, and I'm quoting, the Catholic faith and the Christian religion ought to be exalted and be everywhere increased and spread, that the health of souls be cared for, and that barbarous nations are to be overthrown and brought to the faith itself. If they will not comply, they may be enslaved or killed by God's will. Pope Alexander VI continues to pronounce ownership of the land being encountered by the Spanish explorers. And he essentially, again, does this from the Arctic Pole to the South Pole in a certain latitudinal split. And you can kind of see those lines in the graph over to the left where he's saying these are ours now. And if it's owned or claimed by another Christian monarch, that's the only reason you wouldn't be able to claim it. And so if an explorer proclaims to have discovered the land in the name of the Christian European monarch, all they have to do is plant their flag there in that soil and report their discoveries to the European rulers that sent them. So European settlers claimed that they were instruments of a theologically prescribed divine design and possessed a cultural and religious superiority endowed to them by God. That all these lands they were encountering constituted the promised lands to them, very similar to the way that the Israelites were promised land. This was for them theologized to be the new Eden that they were meant to dwell within. The treaty here was signed in Spain in 1494, and it divided all these discovered lands outside of Europe, basically between the Portuguese and the Spanish. And this establishes the islands that are then entered by Christopher Columbus in his voyage in 1492. And here we have a painting of the man himself planting his flag, quite literally making the claim. He was an Italian explorer and colonizer. He actually did 4 different voyages across the Atlantic Ocean using Henry the Navigator's system of currents and winds. His expeditions inaugurated the formal period of exploration and conquest and colonialism that would last for centuries, helping create the modern Western world as one that is Christian nationalism and white superiority. I want you to know that all the cultural aspects, the philosophy, theology, material culture that is exchanged between the old world and what they were calling the new world that follow on Christopher Columbus is known as the Columbian Exchange. It's named after him. Among that exchange were the diseases that he and others brought with them, and we'll talk about that in a moment. The indigenous people that he encountered were among them the Taino and the Arawak and the Lucayan. They were very described by him as peaceful and friendly. He also, though, said he was interested that they help him find the gold, the things that needed to go back in the really literal venture capitalism that he was sent to do. And he writes in his diary, his notes about this voyage, about them, he says, quote, "They ought to make good and skilled servants, for they repeat very quickly whatever we say to them. I think they can very easily be made Christians, for they seem to have no religion. If it please our Lord, I will take 6 of them to your highnesses when I depart, in order that they may learn our language." Columbus noted that their primitive weapons and military tactics made them susceptible to conquest, and he wrote, "These people are very simple and have no warlike matters. I would conquer the whole of them with only 50 men and govern them as I please." The Spanish were the first Europeans to explore and establish settlements in what today is Virginia. Let me say that again. The Spanish were the first to establish settlements in Virginia. The English settlements didn't occur until the 1600s. In 1607 in Virginia, 1620 in Massachusetts, about 80 years following the first Spanish colony in the US, and 40 years after the first colony of the Spanish in Virginia. So the consequence of that is the Spanish influence. They are enslaving the people that they encounter. They are taking them back to Spain. This comes relevant and when we start talking about what's going on in Virginia. They start force migrating them, and people like the Powhatan Confederacy are forced northward from their usual habited lands, and that impacts what happens later in 1607 when the English encounter the Powhatan. In the first 2 centuries of Spanish colonizing in the New World, Chesapeake Bay, where the British later land, is marked by that little red dot. So back again a little bit to England's involvement here. Henry VII grants a patent to John Cabot and his sons in 1496. John Cabot was, again, an Italian, a navigator and explorer, and he goes to the coast of North America with the commission of the British monarch. And it's the earliest known European to explore the coastal North America area. And we do believe that he was after the Norse did the same thing to Vinland in the 11th century. And then we come finally at heritage, knowing that the land has already been highly impacted by disease, by slavery, and by exploitation of resources. We get to 1607 when Jamestown Colony is the first permanent English settlement in North America. It's located near present-day Williamsburg, Virginia, and it was the first private venture financed and organized by the Virginia Company of London, by King James I, who granted a charter to literally a group of investors. We tend to romanticize this as people who were seeking religious freedom. That's back in Massachusetts. These folks are coming for venture capitalism under the crown. They've literally been financed by business people back home who expect to be paid and have goods sent back to them for their trouble in financing these ventures. A contingent of about 105 colonists depart England in December 1606, and these 3 ships, bonus credits on most quizzes. The ships are Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery. Under the command of Christopher Newport, they reached Chesapeake Bay on April 26, 1607. And I want to note that Vicar Robert Hunt of the Church of England was the chaplain of the expedition. And here is a photo of a reenactment done about that moment. And you can go to visit Jamestown Colony and the colony of Indigenous folks who are kind of a living history museum encounter. Now, Captain Smith's writings about this make Captain Smith's religious feelings very clear. And he writes this: I conclude that God, who had thwarted the Spanish attempts to settle here in North America, was actually reserving this region for the Protestant English, unquote. I'm going to compare a little cultural contrast here. And even pictorially, you can see the differences in material culture between Jamestown Colony on the left and the Powhatan Confederacy on the right, not only in shape, but in militaristic attitude on the left versus security purposes on the right. And this circular community that's indigenous and this more structured high material culture on the left. There's a sense that the Powhatan people had been driven north into Virginia by the Spanish explorers, and that's where the Confederacy emerges under the leadership of Powhatan. His father actually formed that Confederacy during his father's time. Now, we tend to also think of most Indigenous people in North America as being what's called semi-nomadic, and many would go to one place for spring, summer, and another place for fall, winter. And that's still the case in Alaska among many Alaska natives. But here among the Powhatan Confederacy, they were actually very sedentary people with some 200 settlements that were protected by these small palisades. And Bradford regards his fellow pilgrims as chosen people. William Bradford, who is part of the Plymouth plantation up north, follows along a similar theological line, saying that those who are coming there are chosen people to fulfill God's divine plan, that they're repeating this biblical story of the Israelites. A little bit more about the Puritans here. They're sort of going to England on the Mayflower, and they're having this separatist movement within Protestantism. They really do feel that they are working out of a sense of superiority and divine will. This is their promised land, and it would continue to be protected by God's divine grace because it was God's will that they do what they were doing. These are some photos, some of these from what is the Jamestown Preservation Rediscovery Project. And it is since these pictures were even added to this presentation has really grown and amassed a lot of artifacts. I include 2 of these pictures here. The Jamestown Church burnt down a couple of times, and the current version is in that lower right. But up above that with this face of a young girl, and that is her skull that's been reconstructed into the facial image. She's being given the name Jane. There's evidence of cannibalism there from the Europeans that were living within the forts. They had a very difficult winter there. And if it hadn't been for the Indigenous people helping them out with that, they would have all died. But they had a really hard winter. They were not prepared for it. They didn't bring the right anything, and they didn't know how to work within that particular biological niche with the foods that were available. So this is just evidence of how difficult that was. On the lower left, you're actually seeing the burial of Robert Hunt, that English vicar. And we know it's him for a couple of reasons. And one of those is that direction his head is turned in is towards the east, which was the custom for burying clergy. Oh, to date, though, the project has retrieved over 3 million separate artifacts. And that first winter, really bad winter of 1609 to 1610, really shows how desperate they were as they were trying to crowd into that fort. We think that Hunt died around 1608, so he did not last. Now, the one that you probably hear the most about and are most familiar with name is Pocahontas. And she is the daughter of Chief Powhatan. In many Indigenous cultures, we receive several different names throughout a lifetime. I had a childhood name, and then as I got older, I had another, and then formal names given in formal ritual, and then names to be only used within medicine circle. Those are all examples. Pocahontas was no different. We believe that the name Pocahontas was actually a childhood name given to her by her father. And if you directly translate it, it means something like spoiled brat. So she was also a person who had an adult name when she grew, named Matoaka. So that is the name by which there's been an icon drawn of her under the name Matoaka. And in April 1613, Pocahontas and her husband, because yes, she was married to an Indigenous man before Smith came on the scene. Her husband was Cocoon, and they were residing in one of the villages there at the Potawatomics. And she was eventually kidnapped. And we will talk about that in here. She was abducted by an Englishman by the name of Samuel Argyle. She was forcibly transported 90 miles south to an English settlement at Henricus on the James River and brought aboard the ship of Argyle as a prisoner during the First Anglo-Powhatan War. And Argyle informed Chief Powhatan that he would not return her unless Powhatan released English prisoners, returned stolen weapons, and sent the colonists food. In captivity, she lived under the care of a minister named Alexander Whitaker and learned about Christianity, learned some English and English culture, and was influenced to convert to Christianity. This painting, done by John Gadsby Chapman, depicts that romanticized version with John Rolfe standing in the red behind her, who would become her English husband. He became a tobacco farmer because of what she was able to teach him about tobacco farming and what tobacco was. She was taken to Europe by Rolfe, and when they were leaving to return, they had to turn back to England because she became very ill, and she died at a port in England called Gravesend and is buried underneath the altar in the chapel at Gravesend, England, which has only a very modest marker there. So she was never able to return home. But this very romanticized version is an enormous painting that actually today is in the Capitol building here in Washington, D.C., in the colonnade, where everyone can see that natives, quote, willingly took on the identity of Christianity and were grateful for their colonization. Back to New England a little bit, I want to pick up on some very common lore that contributes to a romanticized American history. The Squantum, who in American literature is better known as Squanto, was a member of the Patuxet tribe. He was an early liaison between the native populations in southern England and the Mayflower Pilgrims. who made their settlement at the site of Squanto's former summer village. Why was it a former village? Because in 1614, Squanto was kidnapped by English explorer Thomas Hunt, who brought Squanto to Spain, where he sold him as a slave. And he was among a number of captives bought by local monks there in Spain, who focused their education on evangelism. And Squanto eventually did travel to England, and from there finally was able to return to North America in 1619, knowing English. He went to the site of his village to find that his tribe had been entirely wiped out by epidemic infection. He was the last of the Patuxet. When the Mayflower landed in 1620, Squanto worked to broker peace relations between the Pilgrims and local tribes and played a key role in those early meetings of 1621. And then he lived with the Pilgrims for about 20 months, acting as a translator and a guide and negotiator. He was not so much the noble savage portrayed in American lore, than a very skilled advisor and diplomat. Now, the nationalistic story of the first Thanksgiving, as we approach Thanksgiving in just a few days, is important for us to bear in mind. Why it is that many Indigenous people are not fond of this holiday. Many are, but others are not. Massachusetts and Virginia are in competition as the setting for the first romanticized version of the first Thanksgiving. However, the most prominent colonist Thanksgiving event in American popular culture is attributed to the 1621 celebration at Plymouth Plantation, where settlers held a harvest feast after a successful growing season. They had that successful season because they were taught by the Indigenous people in the area. The Plymouth settlers, known as Pilgrims, had settled in the land. It was abandoned when the plague struck, killing everyone but Squanto. And from the Pilgrims' point of view, the first Thanksgiving is meant to be a day set aside for prayer and worship. We think that took place in July of 1623, and Governor William Bradford declared a day of Thanksgiving to give thanks for rain that had ended a drought and saved the harvest. A few years later, we would see a fragile early peace between the Native Americans and early settlers unravel in really a horrific manner in what is now known as Mystic, Connecticut, where the Pequot tribe was celebrating their own seasonal Thanksgiving, the Green Corn Festival. In the pre-dawn hours, European settlers, not the Pilgrims, but a band of Puritans, came upon their village, shot, clubbed, and burned alive over 700 Native men, women, and children. This slaughter, according to Robert Jensen, a professor at the University of Texas in Austin, was the real origin of Thanksgiving, proclaimed in 1637 by Massachusetts Bay Governor John Winthrop. It was held in gratitude for God's destruction of the Pequot village. Thereafter, massacres of Indians were routinely followed by what the Christian English referred to as days of Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving becomes something formalized within the nation's calendar following the Civil War as an effort to help unite the fractured nation. It became a way of trying to establish a sense of community among diversity of white people. And the colonial ideology became the identity of what the lore became, of what it was to be truly American in the midst of that diversity. And teaching within English American schools began to define Americanism for any immigrants that followed. One of these was the sanitation or the sanitized story of Thanksgiving, fabricating a peaceful depiction between colonizers and tribes, neglecting to mention the amount of genocide, destruction, and land grabbing. Westward expansion is the 19th century movement of settlers continuing to press toward the American West. It began with the Louisiana Purchase and was fueled by gold rush, further desires for development and commercialism and venture capitalism. The Oregon Trail exists because of that desire and a belief of a sociocultural theology that would become known as manifest destiny, building on the same ideas of the originating colonizing community. This painting is called American Progress. Newspaper editor John O'Sullivan is credited with coining the term manifest destiny in 1845 to describe an emerging mindset in the American political scene of white leadership. Manifest destiny was an expression of the conviction in the morality and value of expansionism that complemented other ideas, including American exceptionalism, romantic nationalism. Andrew Jackson, who spoke of, quote, extending the area of freedom, unquote, typified the conflation of America's greatness with the nation's budding sense of romanticized self-identity. And so in this painting of 1872, artist John Gast employs an allegory representing the modernization of the New West. The white-robed figure is called Columbia. Guess who she's named after? Because there's a direct and intentional connection to the founding of this nation as a colonized identity. She is now shown here bringing light from the east to the west, stringing telegraph wire, holding a school textbook of what will instill knowledge and highlights different stages of economic activity as being more civilized than the indigenous peoples being driven ahead of it into the darkness. The 19th century belief that the United States would eventually encompass all of North America is known as continentalism. An early proponent was John Quincy Adams, who essentially, between the expansion of the Louisiana Purchase and the Polk administration's expansion, Adams wrote this, quote, the whole continent of North America appears to be destined by divine providence to be peopled by one nation, speaking one language, professing one general system of religious and political principles, and accustomed to one general tenor of social usages and customs. In this, diversity never had been and was not then a value. He formulated the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, which warned Europe that the Western Hemisphere was no longer open for European colonization. Manifest destiny played its most important role in an Oregon boundary dispute between the United States and Britain when the phrase manifest destiny originated. And during the Pig War, which was actually held in my area of the country, just north of the island where I live on Whitby. If you look at that little map on the right, down in the right-hand corner, you'll see Whitby. And San Juan Islands, with San Juan Island itself, are just a little bit northwest of us. This on San Juan Island is where the Pig War occurred between the British and the US. It got started by a guy who actually had a pig roaming around, and it ended up being a property dispute. That's what created the boundary between Canada and the US. The primary obstacle for European settlers and westward expansion in their idea of their promised land was the fact that the land was not at all empty, even though ravages of disease had a significant impact on indigenous communities in South, Central, and North America by the early 1600s. There were still populations and lands. Every single color and area on this map is a separate, distinct indigenous nation. when you are working and living and speaking and interacting with Native people, you are engaging in international relationships. Every colored area here representing a civilization represents thousands of people. The indigenous peoples were specialized within their biomes in life ways that were closely linked and reflected the ecological zones that they inhabited, the spirituality that joined them to that specific place. They were people specialized for living in places like tidewater environments or marshlands, hardwood forests, or lakes and river systems, in deserts, high plains, in mountain habitats, and in Arctic zones. They had their own stories, their own prophecies, their own relationship with God, their own beliefs and technologies and life ways and songs and dances, weapons and spiritual warriors, their own education, their own medicine. Under the influence of capitalism, the Christian colonists did not see value in any of those biomes and environments other than how it could be sent back to venture capitalists who had sent them or from which they personally could gain. Whereas indigenous peoples lived within an economic model of reciprocity, of a spiritual practice of mutual cultivation and kinship with all living beings who were believed simply to be different types of people. One of the resources that I often recommend to people, because it comes as a book or it comes as a National Geographic video series, is a Pulitzer Prize-winning Guns, Germs, and Steels, The Fates of Human Societies. And it really lays out quite clearly the ideas and technology that were in play from the Europeans. And the argument is made here that this America was not so much created out of any kind of superior intelligence on their part, but was the result of a certain chain of developments, each made possible by preconditions that had nothing to do with the Europeans other than negative impact. Coming back to this idea of the Columbian Exchange as including the transfer of diseases soon after Europeans and enslaved Africans who'd been enslaved by Europeans arrived in the New World. They brought with them infectious diseases that had an immense impact on indigenous communities who began to die from these diseases almost immediately. You see in the 1500 graphic, the year 1500 is population density of indigenous peoples in South, Central, and North America. 100 years later, you see that rapid decline in population density of indigenous peoples. And there's a detailed study in climate science published in the Science Quarterly Review in 2019 called Earth System Impacts of the European Arrival and the Great Dying in the Americas after 1492. The Great Dying estimates that prior to European contact, more than 60 million indigenous peoples populated the Americas, 60 million. However, between 1492 and 1619, less than 200 years, an estimated 56 million of that 60 million indigenous people died in wave after wave of pandemic, destroying 90% of the indigenous population over 126 years before even the arrival of the Jamestown colony. European military leadership frequently employed germ warfare quite intentionally to help solve what they called the Indian problem. For example, a letter of British Commander Geoffrey Amherst indicated genocidal intent when he authorized the deliberate use of disease-infected blankets as a biological weapon against indigenous populations in the 1763 Pontiac Rebellion. He wrote, "You will do well to try to expose the Indians by any means of blankets, as well as to try every other method that can serve to extirpate this irascible race." He instructed his subordinates, quote, "I need only add that I wish to hear of no prisoners, should any of the villains be met with arms." When smallpox swept the northern plains in 1837, the U.S. Secretary of War Lewis Cass ordered that no Mandan, Arikara, Cree, and Blackfeet be given smallpox vaccinations, which were available at the time. He wanted those to go to friendly tribes willing to work with the U.S. government. The American Indian Wars is the collective name for various armed conflicts that were fought by European governments and colonists, and later by the United States and Canadian governments and American governments and settlers against various American Indian and First Nations people. But after Custer's defeat in the Battle of Little Bighorn, known to the Lakota as the Battle of Greasy Grass, the U.S. Army stepped up its campaign against Western tribes in a series of military engagements, as well as massacres that were quite intentional. The Army defeated powerful tribes like the Lakota and the Apache. By the time of the massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890 on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, violent Native American resistance had almost completely ended, along with the population of the animals and ecological zones upon which they had depended. Lifeways that did not get to migrate with them. This image here shows the number of forts that were created as part of westward expansion. That westward expansion was not a cowboy enterprise, it was a military one. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 authorized the U.S. government to enforce the Indian removal from east of the Mississippi River to the west, what the government considered the sparsely populated areas by settlers. These forced migrations contributed to further deaths of people along the trail, with the Cherokee notably understanding their history in terms of the Trail of Tears. There were many, many trails of tears. Washington Territory Governor Isaac Stevens tried to compel Indian tribes to sign treaties to cede land and establish reservations. They were called reservations because they were lands reserved by the government for the indigenous peoples to move or be forcibly migrated onto. The Yakima of Washington State signed one of the treaties negotiated during the Walla Walla Council of 1855, establishing the Yakima Indian Reservation, for example. However, none of the treaty rights were ever maintained. There is no treaty among the many nations of indigenous peoples that has not been broken by the federal government at one time or another. The Puget Sound War is often remembered in connection with the Battle of Seattle and the execution of Nisqually Chief Leschi, a central figure of that war. He was hanged for murder, even though it was war, in 1858, and was not exonerated by Washington State until 2004. Throughout the late 1850s, in the lead up to the Dakota War of 1862, all the treaty violations by the United States, and later unfair annuity payments and late payments or no payments at all by Indian agents, caused massive increased hunger and hardship among the Dakota. And during that time, the Dakota made extensive attacks on settlers and immigrants, which resulted in settler deaths, causing many settlers to flee the area. But intense desire for immediate revenge by the US military ended with soldiers capturing literally hundreds of Dakota men, women, and children, and interring all of their families. They sentenced 303 to death for crimes. President Lincoln would later commute the sentence of all but of 264 of them leaving 38 Dakota men, who on December 26, 1862, were hung in Mankato, Minnesota. It is the largest mass execution in United States history. For the Lakota, who had become Christians under the influence of Episcopal missions in that area, under the direction of the Right Reverend Henry Benjamin Whipple, the 38 men walked up that scaffold, chanting a hymn, a Christian hymn in their own language, set to a traditional Lakota tune. The hymn that they were singing in Lakota, we have in our hymnal as hymn 385, Many and Great. A local reporter who witnessed the event wrote, "The barbarians went to their death, singing in their savage language to their pagan gods. It is impossible for Americans and savages to coexist." Many in Indigenous leadership in the church would encourage that this song, Many and Great, not be sung as a way to honor Native people, rather to use it in commemorative events with full awareness of this history. By the time of the massacre at Wounded Knee, as I said, the resistance was almost just futile and reflective of the feelings of many Indigenous leadership in many tribes. Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce wrote, "I am tired. My heart is sick and sad. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever." In addition to the forces of disease and war and removal from their habitable traditional lands, Indigenous peoples were subjected to a government plan of intentional mass assimilation, carried out by Christian missionaries and schools built by the government for that purpose. Henry Moore Teller, serving as Secretary of the Interior in the 1880s, voiced the economic expediency of assimilation versus war when he argued that it would cost $22 million to wage war against natives over a 10-year period, but would cost less than a quarter of that to, quote, educate them. 30,000 children for 1 year. This photo shows a group of Apache children who were forcibly removed from their homes in the West in order to live and be raised at the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. They're shown here upon their arrival to Carlisle in 1866. Here is the same group only a few months later. Richard Pratt, founder of Carlisle School, agreed with the governmental policy when he wrote, "A great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one. In a sense, I agree with that sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indians there are in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man." Conditions at residential schools were emotionally, psychologically, physically, and sexually abusive. Deaths of Native children were frequently not reported and interred in unmarked graves. There were more than 350 government-funded, church-run Indian boarding schools across the US in the 19th and 20th centuries. When Indian children were abducted by government agents, sent to schools by the hundreds of miles away, where they were beaten, starved, or otherwise abused if they spoke their native language. Though we don't know how many children were taken in total, by 1900 there were 20,000 children in Indian boarding schools, and by 1925, that number had tripled. In 1823, the Christian doctrine of discovery was quietly adopted and formalized into US law. When the Supreme Court, in the celebrated case of Johnson v. McIntosh, wrote under Justice John Marshall, where he observed that the Christian European nations had assumed ultimate dominion over the lands of America during the Age of Discovery, and that upon discovery, the Indians had lost their rights to complete sovereignty and they lost their rights to be independent nations, but only retained a right of occupancy. According to Marshall, the United States, upon winning its independence in 1776, became the successor nation to the right of discovery and acquired the power of dominion from Great Britain. When discussing legal precedent to support court's findings, he said about John Cabot's explorations that, quote, the doctrine of discovery, then paraphrasing, he says, notwithstanding the occupancy of natives who were heathens, and at the same time admitting the prior title of any Christian people who may have made a previous discovery, we are that inheritor. Native Americans were legally named citizens of the United States in 1924. Even so, they were not eligible to vote in every state until 1962, when Utah became the last state to remove formal barriers. But the roadblocks remain in many states even to this day. Restrictive voting laws throughout the United States often carry a very discriminatory effect because they ask for specific address. An address labeled and granted by state and federal government, which is difficult if you're living in remote areas. If you need an address for your voting card, you're not going to be able to vote. For example, in the state of Washington, the Native American Voting Rights Act was not signed into law until March 14, 2019, by Governor Jay Inslee. The bill allowed for the residential address portion of voter registration to be filled out with a non-traditional address. Non-traditional addresses is the system on most Native reservations. The view from outside the romanticized version of American history that is the story of dominant culture in the United States reveals a disturbing truth that informs a historical intergenerational trauma. It is part of today's reality and identity of every single Native American alive today. Raphael Lemkin was a Polish Jewish jurist who was the first, when he moved to Washington, D.C. in the summer of 1942, to create a definition of genocide. When he coined this term, it was in his own experience as being a Jewish survivor of the dominant Nazi atrocities in his book, Axis Rule in Occupied Europe, where there he lays out this European lens. In light of the concept of genocide formulated by Lemkin, the expansion of various European colonial powers, such as the Spanish and the British empires, and subsequent establishment of colonies on indigenous territory frequently involves acts of genocidal violence against indigenous groups in the Americas, in Australia, in Africa, and in Asia. And according to Lemkin, colonization was itself a genocidal act. On the one way that the federal law continues to limit indigenous population growth is through what is called blood quantum. Blood quantum laws, or Indian blood laws, are laws on the books in the United States that define Native American identity by percentages of ancestry. Unlike African Americans, who, if they had one drop of African American blood, were considered people who were African American. Indigenous people, because their identity was tied to the treaties between Indigenous people and the government, where the government had to provide education and healthcare. They didn't want to provide education and healthcare or other services to more people than they had to. So blood quantum laws define the fraction of ancestry for total ancestry documented as either full blood, half blood, or quarter blood, but no less. This eliminates multiple fourth-generation grandchildren from the rights and benefits of the U.S. government that were obtained through those treaty rights. Historians and scholars whose work has examined this history in the context of genocide have concluded that it's impossible to know what transpired in the Americas during the 16th through 19th centuries and not conclude that it was genocide. Proponents of the default position emphasize attrition also by disease, despite other causes equally deadly, if not more so. According to scientists from the University College London, colonization of the Americas by Europeans killed so many people, it resulted in climate change and global cooling that affected Northern Europe. And the idea of genocide is much more broad than simply killing members of a group directly, but also involves a definition of serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, even over generations, such as blood quantum, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another. This continues today in laws around adoption. The legacy of the doctrine of discovery is not relegated to the past, and I hope you've heard that. It is still very much alive in governmental and dominant cultural relationships with Native peoples in the United States. And there are many ways in which the doctrine continues to inform the appropriation, co-optation, and exploitation of Native cultures and Native identity. Now let's consider a few of the ways we are all caught in the web of the legacy of the doctrine of discovery, still living from socio-cultural script that our ancestors lived together and that we inherited together as a part of our shared American identity. First of all, the same ideas of ownership, romanticized nationalism, inculcated in the doctrine of discovery continue today in a consumerism of Native identity, turning culture into costume or dominant culture fashion with no understanding or appreciation of Indigenous context, meaning, history, and tradition. It's all up for grabs in the marketplace of dominant culture. The difference between cultural appropriation, culture borrowing, and culture adoption are very important distinctions. Or cultural appreciation, excuse me. So appropriation, borrowing, and appreciation. Cultural appropriation is an inappropriate adoption of customs or practices of a society by members of another that it cannot actually belong to, but can only, quote, act as if they belonged to a subculture. By contrast, cultural borrowing is learning practices from another culture and with permission of teaching, being able to continue or perpetuate those expressions, or even create new and hybrid creative expressions. Cultural appreciation is much more about wanting to learn, wanting to hear and listen, and being respectful of the boundaries of identity. Collecting Native goods, for example, from Native artists can be cultural appreciation. Confusing culture for costume is a common trait of dominant society and can be an unconscious or conscious way of denigrating a minority group through enacting their cultural stereotypes ascribed by dominant culture. This too is often defended as honoring Indigenous people. However, the impact of putting on Indigenous culture as though it were simply a costume for dominant culture amusement does not in fact have the impact of honoring Indigenous people. Another manifestation of cultural appropriation and identity over time has been the use of Native images and symbols in the dominant culture marketplace, an extension of the doctrine of discovery's premise that all that is discovered is up for the taking and advertising and consuming. It wasn't until just a couple of years ago that Land O'Lakes butter got rid of the Indigenous maiden who was on their products. However, the artist who created that image defended it by saying that he'd done careful cultural research. Be aware that your cultural research may yet not be something that has a sense of honoring. But it is the relationship that is important in any new venture, which has been successful among high school sports teams who seek to truly honor the Indigenous people by changing the nature of their mascot and learning more about the Indigenous values that inform it. Redskin is a slang term that came up when terms were being applied of color to people of color to distinguish them as not being white. In the same era of the 19th century, when people suddenly became earmarked as black, as yellow, or red, it is a way of disparaging and insulting and separating people simply by skin tone. Integral to the Euro-American identity and the romanticism of the Wild West is the colonial narrative of the doctrine of discovery serves to mask the reality of war and removal and genocide. Native Americans have been, until only very recently, often whitewashed, played by non-native actors, their identity being admired, but absorbed and played out by others. In this way, Native identity becomes domesticated by dominant culture. In dominant culture, literature, and art, Indigenous people took on the role of the noble savage, the wise but lost race that is no more, with only the wildness allowed expression to be done in the bedroom. It can only be wild in romance novels, usually between a Native man and a white woman. And finally, no discussion of Indigenous appropriation of symbol and identity can conclude without pointing to the co-optation of Indigenous images in American sports. Native culture, symbols, dress, lifeways are not, in fact, up for grabs by any artist. The doctrine of discovery continues to do harm through these appropriated images. Because if you want your own team, please use your own image, like on the right. However, recently the Indians have changed their name to the Guardians after many, many years of being asked to not use that logo. No other majority in the United States is owned by the sports the way Indigenous identity is still used on the field of play, continually reenacting dominant culture by playing cowboys and Indians on the field. Whether we name it as racism or white privilege, it must be called out as wrong. Can you imagine any other group being used as a sports franchise and getting away with it? Now, there are many kinds of ways the doctrine of discovery continues to impact our current condition of climate change, but it is also a place that intersects with social justice issues for Native Americans around loss of sacred sites, fossil fuel extraction industries, man camps that are set up by extractive industries for the laborers, where we have the phenomenon that accompanies it of high rates of missing and murdered Indigenous women and children, the continual and perpetual changing land status by the federal government when it suits them for economic reasons, and the federal criminalization of peaceful protests, which really spiked at Standing Rock. Also contributing to declining biodiversity. Be aware that 90% of the remaining biodiverse realms on the planet, 90%, are inhabited and stewarded by Indigenous populations. To be supporting Indigenous social justice is to be doing ecological justice as well as Native sovereignty, and to help counteract the loss of cultural lifeways. These are just a few examples of sites that are sacred to the local Indigenous populations, places of peace and power, places where dominant culture tourists and science would very much like to use as platforms for their interests. And the problem is when Indigenous people like Daryl House, who's Oneida and Navajo, stepped off a trail at Petroglyph National Monument in Albuquerque to say prayers and gather herbs, he was arrested by a park ranger. He said, Daryl responded, we don't have a set time. We don't have set places. We don't have buildings. We don't have places of worship. Nature is where we've been worshiping. This is where we've been gathering. This is where we live. This is what we've been protecting. Why do you think your job is better than mine when we both are trying to protect nature? For many years, the US federal administration has sought to open up several more millions of acres of currently protected sites on Indigenous lands. And we know that some of our bishops are involved in some of these fights, like at Mauna Kea, Hawaii, and the efforts there among Indigenous clergy and the bishop to continue to protect that site. And in the Arctic National Wildlife Village Refuge in Alaska, where Bishop Mark Latine has written very eloquently around the need to protect that environment for the Indigenous people there. The uranium mines in Navajo land and the toxic mining water spill of Animas River continue to affect both the plant life, agriculture, and Indigenous peoples in those areas. The phenomenon I've mentioned of man camps and missing women, Washington State is the first state to have created a code red, much like an amber code for missing children and a silver code for missing senior citizens. The red code is now just been instituted last week as a way to alert the community to missing women, Indigenous women. So we have to ask our question of whether we're open for business in the colonial attitude toward environment, or whether we're really interested and invested to collaborate in meaningful partnerships to preserve the earth. Here is some pictures from Standing Rock as an example. Many of you on this call, or some of you may have participated and responded to the Episcopal Church invitation with the permission of elders to come and participate in an action event. And just the contrast you see in these pictures of the young man on a horse and with this military equipment, what is going on in their minds that they feel like that's even an appropriate way of dealing with American citizens? When I was there, they called us insurgents. They didn't refer to us even as people. They used voluminous amounts of tear gas. And that upper right-hand picture, which I took, was an example. There was a young woman in the midst of that crowd. And they were trying to, they went across the river in freezing cold water to ask the military and police that were there to please just move back a bit from the hill that they were occupying, because it was a sacred burial site. They were only asking if they would move their equipment by about 150 yards. And they were met with this response, men rappelling down the hillside, coming with these giant canisters of tear gas. And this young woman was square in the face, not less than 6 feet away from the police officer doing this to her, spraying tear gas in her face, directly into her face. It was so thick, it ran down her face like milk. And she would go underwater and wash it off her face as best she could, keeping her eyes closed because it burned. She came back up from the water and said, "Why are you doing that? You are my brother, and I am trying to protect this river, not just for myself and my people, but for you and your people, because we are one kin." And he would spray her in the face again, and she would go back down into the water again. And she did that 3 and 4 times just while I was watching. In Washington State, the example of the Columbia River Basin is another one in which the Indigenous population's relationship with salmon is a sacred relationship that, in fact, helps harmonize and balance nature, as well as continue to provide opportunities for instructing the next generation in important cultural lifeways, and lessons, and language, and values. These are our work with helping to support the environmental justice issues that concern Indigenous peoples also helps protect them. People are not separate from the environment, which is one of the ways the lens of the doctrine of discovery of colonialism did separate people in the sense of being connected to environment. And I believe Christianity needs to be about the reparative work of the relationship between people and environment in dominant culture. Native health and community. I won't go through all of these, but as I lift these up to you, just be aware that there are 5.6 million people classified as American Indian or Alaska Native in our country. We're less than 2% of the total US population, but we live outside we live outside our tribal areas, most of us. 22% live on reservations. Most are in urban areas. So if you're a church in an urban area, you have natives around you. You need to discover where they are. And there are 573 federally recognized tribes with more than 100 states recognizing tribes. Many are not state or federally recognized, which means that they are not getting what they deserve through even their treaty rights. They're disproportionately affected in poor health, diabetes, and many other things. And usually the federal healthcare delivery system is not meeting the needs. When the pandemic of COVID-19 first hit Navajo Nation, they begged for supplies from the federal government to help deal and help their elders and their children. They were losing elders. To lose a native elder is like a library burning down. And the very first supplies that they were sent by the federal government was caseloads of body bags. We have, for our percentage of population, we have a disproportionate sense of incarceration, of quality of healthcare is much poorer, and the violence that occurs is higher, especially towards women, by psychological aggression by a partner. Rates of addictive disorders and diabetes are disproportionately higher due to loss of Indigenous food and food preparation resource lifeways. And compared to the total US population, more than twice as many Native Americans live in poverty as any other group. We have significantly greater proportion of psychological distress and PTSD, which is part of the historic trauma. And overall suicide rates are similar to those of whites, except when it comes to our youth, which are disproportionately much higher. Native Americans, as I said, are also subject to greater instances of drug and alcohol abuse. There's a general Native American worldview that encompasses the notions of connectedness, reciprocity, balance, and health that are all holistic. So when we're addressing Native health issues, we have to approach it with a cultural inclusiveness and holism. So we're suffering from historical trauma, culture loss, loss of language in many instances, loss of land and traditional lifeways, trapped in cycles of poverty, abuse, and homelessness, and underfunded for medical resources, and continue to suffer from a loss of youth to what our elders refer to as an epidemic of suicide. Furthermore, in the midst of all this, dominant culture continues to romanticize and consume Native culture as an economic commodity and the right of American identity. So that was pretty bleak, but let me tell you about what the Episcopal Church is doing historically and where we have hope and where Indigenous people continue to celebrate our diversity, our generational giftedness, our skills, our culture, our languages, our dances, and the Episcopal Church here. Oops, let me go back. I totally messed that up at all. Hold on, I have to escape so I can go back to the right one. Hold on for just a moment. I messed that right up. I was too quick on the draw. Okay. Let me reshare. Thank you for that pause. Okay, so here we have pictures of Emma Gabo, and some of you may be familiar with him as one of the earliest Native Americans to be ordained in the Episcopal Church. He was the first to be ordained a priest in our church by Bishop Jackson Kemper. He was ordained as a deacon in his youth in 1859 and served at Crow Wing in Minnesota. He helped found the St. Columbia Mission and was someone who Bishop Whipple then ordained as a priest. He's encouraged Chief White Cloud's mission to establish peace between the Ojibwe and the Sioux. And again, he was a noted orator and peace bearer and a person who connected the Episcopal Church to Native community in a very profound way. Indigenous leadership in the church has continued to expand throughout very slowly, but supportively with baby steps. And now we're at a very important time, I believe, in the further development of an opportunity for Indigenous leadership in the church. What you're seeing on the left is our Indigenous missioner, Reverend Dr. Brad Hoff, who's Lakota. And then in the center, you're seeing how we celebrated the original Jamestown Covenant. We adopted that at the 7th General Convention. You can go and Google that, look for it on the General Convention archive site, and you can find it. It's one thing to say, we're really sorry about what we did in 1607. Because it's easy to make statements like that and pass resolutions like that. It's another thing to actually do the hard work of establishing relationships with Indigenous people in your area, because that's where we all need to head. And what you see on the right is a picture of a formal ceremony repudiating the doctrine of discovery, which we did. And again, you can go to the General Church Archives, General Convention Church Archives, and find that repudiation specifically and the language for that. And then in addition to Brad Hoff, we've been passing resolutions at General Convention as Indigenous people. And one of those, 76th Convention, created, did that, again said, we repudiated the doctrine of discovery. Then we passed one in 2018 that asking for doctrine of discovery training to be given to all our leadership in the church and people in seminary who are going to be, because one of the things about it is the church has this wonderful way of ordaining people and saying in their training, they say, you're going to be ordained as a person for the whole church. What they mean by that is the default dominant culture church, the white church. So when I've heard that as a person of color, I know that's code for you need to not just be about being Indigenous people and you're doing your Indigenous stuff. You need to understand that you're being ordained for the whole church. And my turnaround question is, really? Are we really? Have you really asked your white peers to go and have time in our Asian Episcopal missions and our Indigenous missions so they understand those? Have they learned those histories? Have they learned the history of Nigerian Anglicans? Have they learned that? Do they understand what the Filipinos have experienced in coming to this country and how they became Anglican and then Episcopal? Do they know? I don't think so. Because guess what? That's the whole church too. We also, in 2018, passed a resolution that brought us our first Indigenous Theological Education Coordinator, the Reverend Dr. Mary Christ, who's doing amazing things. She is creating two different opportunities for Indigenous leadership in the church to have seminary training. One of those being fully online through Bexley Seabury. And another one, she'll be working closely with an Indigenous college in Oklahoma to create an on-site opportunity as well. And this is a public declaration to tribal peoples that was put together by several bishops and denominational executives as an example from the Pacific Northwest. So it's an interfaith statement. Is these kinds of opportunities in your area can be very important and helpful, and renewing those things and making sure that people know that these things exist. These statements exist from the church can be very important, especially if you want to do some study during Native American Heritage Month And we also have in my state, Washington State, we have an Indigenous circle of people, mostly urban natives, because most of us have immigrated because of the history of our diocese. They never established an Indigenous mission. There was never an Episcopal mission ever in its entire history. But the gentleman on the right, Darren Chittister, in that photo on the left, he's on the far right of that photo. He was just finally ordained, and he is Aleut. And on the far left is Alan Hicks, who's Potawatomi. And we are hoping that Darren will be able to establish our first mission among the Nisqually, who have invited him to do that. On the right, you're seeing a picture of the Anglican Indigenous Network, one of the best kept secrets in the Episcopal Church. The network includes multiple countries within the Anglican Communion and has Indigenous representatives from places like Canada, Hawaii, North America, South America, Australia, New Zealand, and parts of Africa. We weren't recognized formally as a network by the Anglican Consultative Council until 3 years ago. And we've been working at it since about 2010. So it's been a while, but we finally did it and we were recognized. And we've even been able to be invited to represent the Anglican Communion to certain events from the United Nations. It's just several different kinds of resources that I can orient you to, and I will make available for you a book list that I often encourage people when they want to know about Doctrine of Discovery, or they want to know about American history specifically, or they want to know about Episcopal history specifically. But I also encourage you to go right to the source here of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. You can find that on the UN webpage. You can Google this, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Peoples. That work continues to inform an ongoing meeting of the United Nations called the Indigenous Peoples Forum, Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. So go to the UN website. All of these books are on a list that I recommend to people, and many more. And again, I'll make that available to your planners so they can send that out to you. I highly encourage you. This is an example in Washington State. You can pull up your own. I get calls from people all over the country saying, we want to connect with Indigenous women or children or issues. And I say, well, who do you know in your state? Who do you know in your diocese? Where are your Native communities? Because those are the people that you want to connect. It's all very good and welcome to send gatherings and offerings to Navajo land or the other aided dioceses like Alaska, North Dakota, and South Dakota. They need our support. We also need the support of UTO grants. Recently, and I'll put this link in the chat, the UTO had a joint webinar with Brad Hoff's office and talking to people who'd received UTO grants for Indigenous ministry. And what's wonderful is these are Indigenous people doing Indigenous ministry that is also contributing to their ability to reconnect with Indigenous cultures. So they're doing their own healing, they're bringing life ways back to their communities, and they're sharing that with the church. These are more. I would also suggest that if you have a parish library, you start to accrue some things, some resources to make them easily available. And they don't all have to be super duper serious. You can have all that Doctrine of Discovery stuff I've been listing, but there's also some really wonderful things being written by Native or Indigenous authors, including children's books, some fun history. And on the right, I highly recommend Drew Hayden Taylor, who has a series of books, Me Sexy, Me Funny. And they just, from an Indigenous perspective, really talk about what are Native people really like? What do we really talk about when we get together? And I will tell you, one of the best things we love for healing is laughter. Most recently, for example, a Canadian broadcaster on a news show had a slip of the tongue, maybe, when she was talking about how it was Indigenous Creatures Month. Well, rather than getting super upset and offended, that immediately generated many memes among young adults and Indigenous artists, and they're really hilarious. So I put a few of them on my Facebook page because it's just part of what it is to live in the dominant culture. Also, I highly encourage you to do some parish study, some congregational study around the local issues important to your tribes. And I guarantee you, a lot of those will be around sovereignty rights, environmental rights, identity. So there's a lot of ways that you can connect and find common ground and move away from a model of colonialism, which was very patronizing and says, we're going to help out the poor pagan babies. Instead of that attitude, like, we're going to go and help you, let Native people lead and tell you what they need you to do and how you connect and show up. If you want the relationship, you need to just show up at Indigenous events. Go press your boundaries around uncomfortability and go to powwows and be a respectful audience and buy from Indigenous artists and not the tourist schlock that somebody else made or a white person imitated. Support work by Native artists, musicians, look at Native films, all of this. There's wonderful TV series, Netflix series out now with reservation dogs. There's just so much that's really transforming. And I feel like it's because dominant culture and Christianity is intuitively understanding that we need to do two things that are vital. We have to work as partners with Native people in the recovery of ecosystems and the preservation of them and change, climate change. And secondly, that Indigenous people are culturally, holistically, spiritually connected to land and earth and understand that it is inhabited by the sacred. And we have sacred relationships, which is a critical restoration for dominant culture Christianity. Read. So many good books out there now around the topics that we've been touching on. Unfortunately, there's only one book and it is no longer in publication, but you can find 400 Years of the Episcopal Church by Owana Anderson. And that is in the list that I will be sending out. But 400 Years of the Episcopal Church by Owana Anderson. And it goes through a walk of all the mission history of the church for about 400 years. Become familiar, create a bulletin board in your congregation about the activities that Indigenous people are doing in your area. And I know some Indigenous leadership in the Episcopal Church that would be very happy to work with your congregation in a orientation to how to be and what to expect at a powwow, for example, and some suggestions on how to best approach Indigenous communities for meaningful relationships. Learn where your Native health opportunities are. Every urban center has an urban Indian health body to be able to provide the federal care through treaty. So find out about the mental health and physical health opportunity, clinics that are in your area so that you can be a person aware and knowledgeable, but also to help refer. Because again, most Indigenous folks who are moving into an urban area are now off land.
Okay, Rachel?
Okay, this is
are you almost at the end?
This is my last slide, Joe.
Okay.
So help teach the difference between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation. So don't support those people who are inspired, artists inspired by Native people, inspire and support Native people who are inspired. Remember our 4 aided dioceses of Navajo Land Area Mission, Alaska, North Dakota, and South Dakota. None of us can change the past, but all of us can change our future. And now I conclude. Thank you for your time and for your listening.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was very powerful insight. Thank you very much for that very powerful, insightful historical analysis on the Native American experience and your heartfelt message of hope.
I wish I could do it shorter, but I can't. I've never found it out.
I know, 400 years in an hour, but you did a marvelous job. Thank you very much. Such rich presentation on the evils of white supremacy. Yeah, you told it with grace in your own authentic manner of truth-telling. Thank you so much. And due to time constraints, if people have questions, put them in the chat box and we'll get them to Rachel, and she can answer them, and we'll get the questions filled.
I also want to just lift up the fact that we have other folks who are familiar with Indigenous needs and lifeways and ministry, like Minnie Steele and Lauren Stanley and Twyla Tubles and others. So just know that you have a community of leadership ready to support you.
Okay, thank you so much. Again, thank you, Rachel, for your very powerful presentation. And also, I want to thank everyone for attending tonight's presentation, and to be on the lookout for the next announcement of the presentation in our continuing speaker series on truth telling. And I would like to add that this Thanksgiving, the commission will be taking a band to the annual Porch Creek Thanksgiving powwow, which is held in Atmore, Alabama, and is attended by thousands every year. And this year will mark the 50th anniversary of the celebration. If you're interested in attending, there's an informational flyer on your computer screen, and it will be up for 10 minutes after the conclusion of tonight's performance. And to close us out now, I once again welcome the Reverend Deacon Susan McKee. Susan? You're muted.
We give you thanks, Almighty God, for all the benefits you have given us. We give you thanks for the disappointments and the failures that lead us to need to learn more about our failures in serving you, to acknowledge our dependence on you alone. And we give you thanks for Rachel's observance of and hearing us and teaching us to know more our failures. So that above all, we thank you for your son, Jesus Christ, for the truth of his word and the example of his life and her life, that we can have steadfast obedience by which we can overcome our failures and rise again to better life, in which we are raised to live in your kingdom. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, everyone. Thank you again, Rachel.
Thank you very much, Rachel.
Very welcome. Thank you. I put my email in the chat, and I'm going to put this link to the UTO webinar that we did so that you can hear from some more Indigenous leaders and ministers.
Okay, thank you. Good night, everyone.